All right, so we're going to move from plants into animals that are closely tied with plants, pollinators. Sorry, this video took a while to get up today. Just got my internet back on. So pollinators are animals that help plants reproduce sexually. These are really only present primarily in angiosperms. Animals do it primarily for nectar. They are not after the pollen. Nectar is a sugary syrup that a lot of flowers produce. They're found in glands called nectaries. There are some arrows right there pointing to nectaries on a tiny flower. Pollinators benefit us significantly. They allow sexual reproduction in plants, which increases their diversity. It also gives them better resistance against diseases. Without them, we would have no fruit because pollinators primarily are producing all of our fruit. And there are quite a few. These are hummingbirds, by the way. And yes, all things that are sweet come from pollinators, with the exception of sugarcane that's wind pollinated. And there's quite a few of different pollinators. These are wild bees found throughout the US. So when I moved in with Kelly 5 years ago, and I'll give you a garden tour as part of your videos this week, there was only one flower in the yard. It's still there. As we started putting flowers in, we noticed all these different tiny bees. Some are called domestic bees. Those are ones raised by beekeepers, but they're wild pollinators as well. And pollinators are going down globally in their numbers, which is not a good thing. It's been linked to a few things, primarily certain pesticides called neonicotinoids, which are synthetic nicotine. Also, a food shortage. If you imagine you only ate one food, you wouldn't be very healthy. So a lot of pollinators, because of loss of wildflowers, they're more vulnerable to disease. One specific disease or disorder that we're still figuring out is called colony collapse disorder in bees. The graph you see here is showing plummeting bee populations because a lot of hives are just completely getting wiped out. One of my favorite pollinators is the monarch butterfly. That's believed, they're often rumored in superstitions to be reincarnated souls of warriors. Amazing thing about monarchs is they have one of the biggest migrations of any insect seen in the world. They're starting to return in the next few weeks. They don't come back really until after the frost is gone. One of the ways we found out about monarchs is through a mark recapture around the United States. Different school groups and researchers put these tiny little stickers with serial numbers on them on the wings of monarchs. They do it in usually August and September. The reason why is the first few generations of when the monarchs fly up here, in the spring, they go through several generations here. It's usually their fourth generation, which is called a super monarch, are ones that are a little bigger, and those ones all fly down to Mexico, hibernate on the trees, and then return the following spring. The way we do it is we mark a bunch of monarchs, thousands to tens of thousands, and then when they get down to Mexico, they look to see how many of the monarchs have marks compared to how many don't, and then they do some math to make a global estimate. This is their migration route, by the way, and it's impressive beyond belief. Most of them on this side of the Rocky Mountains all fly down to oil mill forests in Mexico. A smaller population on the other side of the Rockies migrates to Southern California and Baja, Mexico. This is how they hibernate on the trees. And it's a type of fir tree called an oyamel tree. And they are so cool. When they hang out in these dense colonies, they keep themselves warm at night, which protects them from freezing. The way they recapture them is every night a few fall off the trees, hit the ground, and freeze. And that's how they do the recapture. And one of the things that's hurting them is logging in this part of Mexico, but the bigger culprit is use of certain pesticides in the US that are not necessarily hurting the monarch directly, but taking away their food source. And this is what's really concerning. If you look, the trend in monarchs was steadily going down until 2013. Right around here is where school groups all around the US started putting in butterfly gardens, as well as gardeners started putting in more things for pollinators. And that's an example of a monarch. It's an indicator species. an indicator species is any species that is first impacted by an environmental problem. In the 1960s and 70s, bald eagles were almost wiped out by the use of DDT, so that would be another example of an indicator species. What was hurting monarchs is loss of habitat, but even more importantly, loss of their food. It's also something that's hurting other pollinators. And the main culprit for monarchs is Roundup Ready crops. Roundup Ready is a really cool science innovation. It's not always being used properly. What they've done is they've put genes into certain crops like cotton, soybeans, and corn, and it makes them immune to herbicide, a plant killer called Roundup. Roundup's molecule is called glyphosate. And if they put this gene in these crops, they can spray an entire field with Roundup and kill every weed. If you've ever weeded a garden, it's a great thing to never have to weed again. Now, if you imagine a giant farm, this is, a really good tool to have. The dilemma with Roundup Ready is when we do it, we wipe out all of the wildflowers on the sides of fields. So even myself, I use Roundup to prepare a garden, but that's different when you're doing it on individual plants compared to blasting an entire field with it. One of the other issues with this is politicians are dumb. The reason why is, as you've already heard, plants have sex. In the case of some plants, their sex, can be miles apart with the help of pollinators. So if you have something like a Roundup Ready gene in a crop, a bee can carry that gene to other soybeans and other fields and actually contaminate other people's farms with the Roundup Ready gene, even if they didn't want it. Now, remember, the gene itself is not bad. The issue is the use of too many herbicides afterwards. And genetic engineering is also not bad. And that's when we just change the DNA of a plant. But in the case of Roundup, it's causing loss of this plant when we use Roundup Ready gene and too much Roundup. This is milkweed. It's the only food that monarch caterpillars will eat. If we don't have milkweed, we lose monarchs. And one thing that they've noticed with the loss of monarchs is it's directly correlated to the loss of milkweed. This is why gardeners, myself included, have started putting more milkweed in our gardens. Later this week, I'm going to show you how to put in a pollinator garden. So what you can do is give them a pollinator garden, and your lesson will be coming later this week. Also, if you ever put in gardens, try to get blooms for the entire season, even if you don't have a yard. Just a few pots of flowers outside on a porch will help them a lot. Shallow dishes of water with gravel help pollinators as well because they do need to drink. The reason why you want to put gravel in there is so that they don't drown. You can also look online to figure out how to make butterfly houses and bee houses. And if you want to figure out what plants to put in, one thing to do is what I did. I talked to my friend Leonard, who's a beekeeper. I've also asked people at nurseries, and as my garden grew, I started noticing what plants the bees and butterflies were really hitting. In the course of 4 years, we went from very few insects in the yard to every August, our yard is butterfly central, where we have kids running around. Actually, one of our neighbor's daughters refers to our yard as the fairy princess garden, which is kind of awesome. Perennials are the plants that come back year after year. This is what we ended up putting in our yard, and I'll give you the garden tour as part of this week's lesson, I promise. And this allowed us to have blooms starting in March, and they go all the way until winter hits in October here. So all of these things are great for providing stuff for butterflies and bees. You can also use annuals, which are plants that only live one season. Those are things like geraniums and petunias. So this was your rapid lesson for today. I'm going to start editing some other videos to put up on this week. Sorry for the delay in getting stuff ready, but I miss you all. Also, just so you know, there's only 2 weeks left of active learning, or whatever the district is calling it. I also get the ability to decide whether or not to give you a final. I think you've been emotionally tested enough this year, so there will be no final for this class. So I miss you all.